A bitter wind swept across the high plains that night, the kind that carried dust, frost, and the sound of distant coyotes crying across empty stretches of land. Most folks stayed inside when a storm like that rolled in, sealing doors, banking fires, and praying their horses didn't freeze outside. But far beyond any ranch fence line or wagon trail, someone was still moving through the cold. She wasn't dressed for winter, and her steps were slow, uneven, like each one cost more strength than she had left. Her long dark hair stuck to her face from wind and ice, her cheeks cut by stray flakes of snow that landed sharp as tiny needles. The storm swallowed her tracks faster than she could make them. As if the land itself was trying to erase her from its memory. She had been walking since dawn, maybe even longer. Her moccasins were torn and stiff, her blanket soaked through. She pressed one hand to her ribs as she stumbled, breathing so shallow it barely stirred the cold air. She looked like someone running from trouble, though no footprints followed behind her. She kept glancing back anyway, as if ghosts chased her up from the valley below. No one saw her collapse. One moment she pushed forward through the wind, the next she dropped silently face first into the snow. Her fingers twitched once, then stopped. The plains went quiet, and the wind howled across her still body. If not for chance, she would have frozen right there, the storm taking her life without witness. But fate had a way of crossing paths when it wanted to, especially in the Old West where strangers met under harsh skies, and survival depended on the kindness of those who barely knew one another. The storm forced alone, Cowboy to ride a different trail than usual. His horse fought the wind, head low, hooves crunching over ice. He didn't expect company. He lived his life without much talk, staying close to his ranch and cattle, avoiding town except when supplies ran low. The world had been quiet for him since last winter when loss made him shut his doors to laughter, visitors, and any warmth that reminded him of things he no longer had. He rode that night only to check his fences before the storm got worse, but destiny led him to the drifting shape in the snow. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a calf that got loose. He almost rode past, but something about the way the figure lay still caught him. He dismounted, brushed snow aside, and froze when he saw the outline of a woman's face. Her skin was pale from cold, her lips cracked, and her long braids were stiff with frost. She didn't wear the clothes of settlers. The beads at her collar, the patterned stitching, the way her blanket was wrapped told him she belonged to one of the native tribes farther south. She looked young, yet worn from hardship, like life had asked too much from her in too short a time. He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, searching for any sign of life. For a moment he felt nothing. Then the faintest beat, slow and fading. He knew if he left her there to go find help, she wouldn't survive. So he gathered her gently, lifting her over his saddle, covering her with his coat, and rode hard toward his cabin. Snow stung his face like needles, and the cold clawed at his hands, but he didn't slow. He muttered words she couldn't hear, promising the night wouldn't take her. By the time he reached his cabin, the storm covered the land in thick white drifts. He kicked the door shut behind them, set her near the fire, and worked fast to warm her body. His cabin was simple, quiet, and filled with old memories tucked into corners. It wasn't built for company anymore. Yet here he was tending to a stranger without knowing her story or whether danger followed her. He set boiling water on the stove, wrapped her in dry blankets, and stayed awake through the night listening to her shallow breaths. She never opened her eyes, but every so often her lips moved, whispering words in a language he didn't understand. When she shivered violently, he pulled her closer to the heat, hoping her spirit still held on inside that cold frame. Morning came slow and pale. The storm calmed, leaving a silent white world outside. He placed a cup of warm broth near the edge of the bed, watching her breathe steadier now. He wondered who she was, why she wandered alone, why she carried no weapon, and who she might be running from. He didn't bring strangers home, especially not women of tribes settlers feared or misunderstood, but something in her calm face felt familiar even though he had never seen her before. It felt like she had lived through a storm far greater than the snow outside, when rays of weak sunlight stretched across the wooden floor. Her eyelids fluttered, her lashes trembling as though waking from a long dream. She opened her eyes slowly, confused at the ceiling above her, her breath tightening in her chest as she tried to sit up. She winced at the pain in her ribs, grabbing the blanket as if unsure whether to run or hide. Her gaze shifted around the small room, noticing the fire, the wooden table, the saddle hanging near the window, the quiet cowboy leaning by the wall watching her carefully. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was wind slipping through the cracks of the cabin. She met his eyes, wary but exhausted. He didn't move closer, not wanting to frighten her. Her voice finally came out weak and hoarse, asking where she was, why he helped her, and whether she was safe. He answered gently, explaining how he found her in the snow, how she nearly froze, and that she was welcome to rest until she could stand again. He didn't ask questions about her past. Though curiosity pressed against his silence, she looked at him again. Longer this time, as though studying someone she might have seen before. Her expression shifted, part fear, part confusion, part memory trying to surface. She pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders, heart racing like she remembered something she wasn't sure she should share. The fire cracked, casting warm light across her face. Thawing the last of the frost clinging to her hair, she swallowed, voice trembling, and whispered something so quiet he barely heard it. She told him she hadn't meant to survive that night, that she thought the storm would end everything. She had escaped something or someone, but she stopped there, refusing to say more. Her eyes drifted toward the door as if expecting shadows to burst through at any moment. The cowboy frowned. He had saved her life, but he suddenly realized this wasn't just a rescue. Whatever trouble had driven her into the cold wasn't finished. The storm outside was nothing compared to what might be coming behind her. As she tried to stand, leaning on the bedpost for balance, the sound of distant horses echoed faintly through the valley outside the cabin, approaching in slow, steady rhythm. Not softened by wind this time, she froze, every muscle tense. He stepped toward the window, hand inching near his rifle. Neither knew who was coming, or whether they came for her, but both knew one thing clearly. Someone else had found her. Trail, the sound of those distant horses faded for a moment, swallowed by the quiet stretch of land, but the uneasy tension stayed between them. The cowboy kept his eyes on the window, though the valley below looked calm beneath the snow, nothing moving but a few drifting flakes. Still, he didn't lower his guard. He knew the land too well to ignore signs like that. Sometimes trouble made noise before it arrived. Other times it rode silent and only revealed itself when standing right at your door. The woman stayed still, steadying her breath, fingers gripping the blanket as though she feared it might be pulled away. Her shoulders trembled less from cold now and more from whatever memory chased her. She didn't say anything, but he could see something heavy behind her eyes. The kind of weight that didn't come from one night of hardship. She had carried that fear long before the storm. He moved away from the window, approached the stove, and poured more hot water into a small tin cup. He set it beside her without forcing conversation. She watched him cautiously, studying every small movement, as though deciding whether he was someone to trust or someone to fear. She brought the cup to her lips with shaking hands, warming them on the metal while the heat slowly worked its way through her body. After a moment of silence, he asked her how far she had traveled and whether she had anyone waiting for her. She looked down, tracing the threadbare blanket with her thumb. She finally whispered that she had once lived far beyond the canyon ridge near the southern borderlands, where the grass is taller and winter doesn't bite so hard. She spoke of a small group of families who moved with the changing seasons, gathering wild herbs, trading quietly with distant ranches, living close to rivers and mountains. Her voice softened when she spoke about home, like she carried both pride and grief, but then something changed in her tone. She said the land had not been safe lately. Something drove her people into hiding, scattering families, cutting them off from their winter camps. She didn't explain what or who caused it, but her eyes hardened when the cowboy asked. She shook her head, refusing to speak more, as though the truth itself was dangerous. He didn't push her. Some stories needed time. Instead, he shared pieces of his own past, not in detail, but just enough to fill the silence. He explained he had lived on this land for years, tending cattle, building fences, trying to keep to himself. Once he had someone beside him. Someone who laughed while cooking dinner, someone who stitched torn shirts, someone who warmed the cabin with more than fire. But winter had taken more than just warmth from him. After that, the house turned quiet, and he learned to live without expecting company or comfort. He didn't say her name, and he didn't need to. The woman saw the heartbreak in the way he watched the flames. Instead of her, their silence became a strange bridge between them. Built from pain neither wanted to describe, but both understood. Outside, the afternoon sun began melting the top layer of snow. The horses' echoes did not return, but neither forgot they might. The cowboy stepped outside to scan the ridge, taking his rifle but moving slow so she wouldn't think he aimed to leave. The cold hit his face again, yet the air carried a faint smell of smoke, something unfamiliar to the direction of the canyon. It wasn't his fire, and it wasn't from town. Someone had camped nearby recently, close enough that the wind carried the scent to his land. He returned to the cabin, boots heavy with snow, as she looked up the moment he stepped inside. She could tell by his expression something had changed. She asked if anyone was coming. He didn't lie. He told her he couldn't be sure, but something was out there, maybe tracking the same path she took through the storm. Her hands tightened around the blanket, jaw clenching as she swallowed back fear. She stood shakily and took a step, though her legs trembled from weakness. She insisted she couldn't stay long, that she shouldn't have come this far north, that her presence might bring danger to his doorstep. He shook his head. He wasn't the kind who threw someone back into the cold after pulling them from death. He said she would stay until she healed enough to walk on her own. She opened her mouth to argue, but something in his tone stopped her. It wasn't harsh, just steady, the kind of voice that came from a man who had made his decision and wouldn't change it. She finally sat back down. Though her eyes remained fixed on the door, as evening approached, he cooked a simple meal. She watched his hands while he prepared it, noticing how careful he was with every task. He wasn't used to guests, but he treated her presence with a respectful distance that made her shoulders loosen. She ate slowly, wary at first, then with quiet hunger that came from days without proper food. When the wind died outside, the land settled into that pale winter silence where every sound carries far. The fire popped once, and she flinched. He noticed. She apologized, saying loud noises made her react before she could think. He told her she didn't need to explain. Later, when she rested again, she traced faint patterns on her arm where faded bruises once lived. She thought he wasn't watching, but he saw. And while he didn't ask who hurt her, he wondered if the same people might be searching for her now. Night fell slower this time, but heavier. The cabin windows rattled softly as a colder wind pressed against the wood. He stayed awake by the fire again, though she slept lighter than before, whispering in half-dreams. The cowboy looked at her and noticed something he hadn't seen earlier. Her wrist carried a handmade band of leather decorated with tiny carved stones. Each piece looked carved by hand, each shape holding meaning. He recognized symbols of protection, travel, and mourning. It told more about her past than she had spoken aloud. As he sat in silence, a distant sound drifted up the valley again. Not horses this time, but voices carried on the wind. They were too faint to understand, but close enough for the woman to awaken instantly, eyes wide, breath sharp. She pushed herself upright without hesitation. Moving to the far-shadowed corner of the cabin like someone who had trained to hide quickly, the cowboy stood too. Gripping his rifle, though he still didn't know what he faced, the voices faded, swallowed by darkness. But neither relaxed. This time she finally spoke with urgency, saying they could not stay if those riders found her here. She said once they picked up her scent or trail, they would not leave without taking her back. She didn't say why they wanted her, but she warned that they didn't fear harming anyone who helped her. He asked the question he had avoided. Who are they? She looked toward the window, her expression torn between truth and silence. She finally answered only with this: they weren't strangers. They were once her own people, and now they wanted her returned. Even if by force, the fire burned lower. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floor and outside. The dark pressed against the cabin walls as though waiting for the right moment to strike. The night was far from over. And whatever she had escaped wasn't finished with her yet. The night passed without riders knocking at the door, but the quiet didn't bring comfort. Instead, it settled like thick dust on both of them, a silence that felt like the land holding its breath. The woman slept only in short moments, waking at each gust of wind or shift of the cabin walls. The cowboy kept watch, leaning against the table with his rifle across his lap, listening to the fire crack and the cold press against the windows. He told himself he was only protecting his home, yet he kept glancing at her as though protecting her had already become part of that duty. When morning light finally touched the ridge, she stood and walked with more strength, though pain still tightened her breath. She asked him where the nearest canyon route led. He explained the geography in simple directions, describing dry riverbeds, deer paths, and hidden ravines that only those raised on the land would know. She listened carefully, mapping each word in her mind like someone planning a path back into danger rather than away from it. He asked if she meant to return to the place she escaped. She looked at the frost on the window and said running forever wasn't living. She needed answers, not just distance. He didn't tell her she was still too weak. She already knew. Instead, he began chopping wood outside, needing movement to think. Snow crunched beneath his boots as his axe split logs in heavy, rhythmic thuds. The wind carried his breath out in white mist. Each swing echoed the question running through his mind. Why would her own people hunt her? Inside the cabin, she watched him through the small window, hands wrapped around a warming cup. She noticed how he moved with quiet strength, how he didn't ask for anything in return for his help. Most men she encountered in her past expected payment, loyalty, or debt. His silence unsettled her more than any demand would have. She touched the leather band at her wrist, running her thumb over each carved symbol. The final stona pale blue piece with a sharp crack down the middle had broken the night she fled. It had once belonged to someone close, someone trusted. The fracture reminded her why she didn't speak names aloud when he came back in. Snow melting in his hair, she finally shared more than before. Not everything, but enough to widen the shadows around her story. She said her camp had divided months ago. There were arguments about new land that outsiders wanted to claim, and some among her people believed deals could be made while others refused. Those who pushed for trade brought strangers into their territory, promising better winters and stronger alliances. Instead, those strangers demanded control, taking resources and forcing choices no one should make. She belonged to the group that resisted, but when leadership fractured, some turned against their own. She didn't know who betrayed them first, but raids began in the night, not from settlers but from familiar faces wearing expressions changed by power. Fires swept through tents, children and elders driven from their beds. And anyone refusing to join the new side was taken, silenced, or punished. She escaped with help from someone she trusted deeply, someone who paid a high cost for it, but she didn't say who. The cowboy listened without interrupting. He realized the conflict wasn't between her tribe and settlers like many assumed. The danger came from within, which made it harder to see and harder to fight. He told her she could stay longer, at least until she healed fully. She shook her head. Staying meant risking his safety. She didn't want another innocent life pulled into a battle she carried behind her, but leaving meant facing the ridge alone, with riders who knew the land better than anyone, before they could speak further. Hooves sounded again, not distant this time, but faint and direct, coming from the eastern trail. The cowboy moved to the doorway, keeping out of sight. The woman slipped to the darker corner of the cabin, her breathing shallow but steady. This time she didn't tremble. She looked like someone ready to fight if she had to. A small group of riders appeared at the edge of the property. Not armed openly, not shouting, just watching the cabin from afar. They sat still on horseback, silhouettes outlined by cold morning light. They didn't approach closer. As if waiting for a signal or deciding whether to push forward, the cowboy whispered that they could be lost travelers. She shook her head. She knew the way they rode. They were scouts, not wanderers. They weren't here to attack. They were here to confirm she was alive. The riders turned away and left without speaking, disappearing over the snowy rise as quietly as they had come. That small, silent encounter changed everything. It meant the search had reached this corner of the plains. It meant they were marking the land. Not storming it, they were circling, gathering, planning. The cowboy put his hat on, stepped outside, and walked toward his barn as though continuing his day, but his eyes followed the tracks long after they vanished. He knew enough about tracking to realize the riders weren't heading home. They were looping wide, likely scouting every trail that led to the cabin. By nightfall, others might be positioned across the ridge, inside. The woman stood by the door with her hand pressed to the wood, face tight with guilt. She whispered that he shouldn't have found her, that she should have died in that snow. He turned back toward her sharply, telling her not to talk like that, not in his house. She lowered her gaze, but her voice carried tremors of old wounds. She said death would have stopped the chase. Living kept it moving. He stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. He said nobody deserved to die alone in the cold, not for someone else's crimes. She looked at him then, eyes softening just enough to show she heard him. Later that afternoon, the tension pushed both of them toward separate tasks. He rode the fence line again, but this time he scanned the hills for movement instead of checking broken rails. She walked along the back of the cabin, gathering dried herbs he stored for winters. When she crushed the leaves in her hands, she recognized fragrances her people once used for healing. It brought memories of a different time, when nights were spent by fires telling stories. Instead of waiting for danger, one memory hit her harder than the rest. A young child she once protected during a raid, a sibling not by blood but by bond. She remembered shielded arms, screams in the dark, and a figure dragging that child away while she fled in the opposite direction. The guilt stayed with her, sharper than any wound. Inside the barn, the cowboy saddled his best horse, muttering to himself about long-range scouting. But somewhere in his thoughts, a different worry formed. If trouble came in numbers, one rifle and a cabin wouldn't hold forever. He had supplies, ammunition, and a few friendly ranchers miles away, but he didn't often ask for help. People had kept their distance since his grief swallowed his life. He wasn't sure he deserved anyone's loyalty anymore. Yet now he found himself needing allies not for his sake, but for hers. By evening, tracks appeared again near the ridge, but no riders were visible. The land felt watched from places the eye couldn't reach. She and the cowboy sat across from each other near the fire, neither eating much. The air smelled of pine smoke and melting snow. The tension hung heavier than the past nights. She finally whispered that if they caught her, she wouldn't be taken alive. He stared at her for a long moment, not with shock, but with the quiet pain of someone who knew what it meant to lose more than flesh. He told her he wouldn't allow anyone to drag her away from his land unwilling. She asked him why he cared. He didn't answer right away. He just looked into the flames, jaw set, breath slow. When he finally spoke, he said saving someone means more than dragging them out of the snow. It means standing with them once they wake. The fire dimmed lower, shadows rising in the cabin again. Outside, unseen figures moved silently along the ridge. Waiting for darkness to work in their favor, neither of them slept. The night ahead was preparing to show its teeth. The sky darkened faster that night, as though the sun dipped behind the ridge early just to avoid witnessing what was coming. The woman sat near the fire with her knees pulled close, staring into the orange glow while the cowboy paced across the cabin floor, restless and sharp-eyed. Snow tapped against the windows in soft flakes, muffling the world outside. But behind that quiet lay danger creeping closer with every passing hour. He checked the rifle again, cleaning its barrel with slow, practiced motions, though she could tell his mind was somewhere far beyond the wood walls. He wasn't afraid of confrontation, but he wasn't eager for a fight either. The last thing he wanted was blood spilled on his land. She watched him and felt a mix of gratitude and guilt. If she had turned a different way in the storm, if she had collapsed under a different tree, he would have been living a peaceful winter night right now. Instead, he was preparing for a battle that wasn't his. She whispered that she should leave before sunrise. He didn't look up. He only asked where she thought she could go while half-healed and hunted by people who knew every canyon trail better than the wind. She had no answer, only silence that pressed heavy between them. He set the rifle down and sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. His voice lowered, rough as gravel yet gentle. He told her running wouldn't stop them. She agreed, but said staying might destroy something good in his life. He shook his head, saying he hadn't had anything good in a long time until she woke up in his bed that morning. She looked down, her breath tight. It wasn't said as affection or promise, only truth from a lonely man who found purpose again. The wind shifted outside, carrying the faint creak of branches, and her head snapped toward the door. She could sense movement long before footsteps ever reached a porch. It wasn't just worry. It was instinct born from months of being hunted. He stood and blew out the lamp, letting the room fall into dim light from the fire alone. Shadows stretched across the floor, hiding their shapes from anyone peering in. He moved silently to the window and angled himself behind the frame, peeking out through a sliver of glass. The valley looked empty, nothing but moonlit snow and dark pines. But then a flicker of reflection caught his eye, metal, not a star. Not ice. Someone was out there. He returned to her and said there were at least 2 riders watching from the tree line, maybe more beyond the hill. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath. He asked if they'd attack now. She shook her head. Not in open space. They would wait for darkness to thicken, then try to surround the cabin, cutting off escape. He asked what they wanted with her. Really wanted, not the bits she had shared before. She hesitated, then said she wasn't just escaping a divided camp. She carried something they considered theirs. Not an object, not land, but knowledge. She had witnessed deals made in secret, maps traded for weapons, leaders paid to sacrifice their own. She escaped knowing the truth, and those who rose to power couldn't risk her speaking it aloud. She looked at the fire, her voice low. The man who helped her flee had been taken after she ran. She didn't know whether he lived. She had left a piece of herself behind that night. The cowboy listened quietly, sensing how much that memory tore at her heart. Later, when the hour grew still, he suggested they leave the cabin before the attackers closed in. He knew hidden gullies that led deeper into the hills, narrow places where riders couldn't follow easily. She nodded, but said if they left, the people hunting her might burn the cabin in retaliation. He shrugged with a stubborn half-smile, saying wood could be rebuilt. Lives couldn't. She stepped closer to him, her hand brushing the fabric of his coat just long enough to show she understood what he was risking. The moment held warmth, but no promises, only a shared breath heavy with unspoken connection. Before either spoke again, a crack sounded in the woods like a dry twig snapping under a boot. They froze. Outside, faint footsteps circled the barn. Another sound came from the opposite direction, low and measured. They weren't charging in. They were positioning, boxing them in like cattle before a snow hunt. The cowboy grabbed his coat and handed her a smaller weapon, one he rarely used. She hesitated before taking it. She didn't like weapons, but she also knew survival sometimes demanded them. They slipped quietly out the back door, leaving the fire burning to make the cabin look occupied. Snow crunched beneath their feet, but each step was careful, controlled. The cold cut their skin like knives, but speed mattered more than comfort. They moved toward a slope thick with sagebrush and rock, following a narrow path that wound between boulders. Halfway down the trail, movement flashed to their right. A shadow darted behind a tree, then another to their left. They ducked behind a large rock, pressing close to the ground. She whispered that they were her people, not outsiders. Their silhouettes carried familiar shapes, familiar stances, familiar resolve. The cowboy watched them, jaw tense. He asked if they would fire. She answered softly that they wouldn't kill her on sight. They'd corner her, drag her back, and silence her under their own laws where no outsider could see. She looked to him then, feeling a fear deeper than death. Not fear of being taken, but fear of destroying the only kindness she had found in months. A whistle echoed across the valley. Long and rising like a hunting call, every figure froze. Torches flared in the distance, lighting a row of riders on the ridge above, forming a wall of shadows against moonlight. She recognized one silhouette immediately, her breath catching in her throat with a painful gasp. The leader of the group. Not just a rival. Someone she once trusted more than family. She whispered one word under her breath, the name she had tried not to speak since she fled. The cowboy heard it, though he didn't know the story behind it. He knew only that whoever stood at that ridge had broken her spirit long before winter tried to take her body. The figure at the ridge lifted a hand, signaling the riders below. They began descending the slope slowly, tightening the ring around the canyon. The cowboy raised his rifle in a steady grip, but she placed her hand on his arm, lowering it slightly. She said if he fired now, the battle would start, and blood would stain a night that hadn't chosen violence yet. He stared at her, torn between common sense and the instinct to protect what fate had put in his care. She stood up slowly, revealing herself in full moonlight, blanket trailing across the snow. The riders paused at her boldness, several lowering their weapons. The leader at the ridge leaned forward. Recognizing her instantly, she called out to him with a voice that carried strength she didn't feel, asking why he broke the vows they once shared, why he walked with men who sold their people's future for iron and gunpowder. Her words echoed across the snowy slopes like a wounded cry. He answered with cold authority that she had become a threat to unity. He said she held too much truth, and truth could destroy the new path they had chosen. He warned her to surrender before dawn. She refused. The cowboy stepped beside her, rifle ready but lowered just enough to show restraint. The leader noticed him and narrowed his eyes like a challenge had been issued. The wind howled across the ridge. Snow swirled like ghostly smoke. The riders tightened formation. No one fired. Not yet, but the night balanced on a blade. So thin a single breath could tip it into chaos. The woman's heart raced. The cowboy's grip tensed. The leader's horse pawed the snow in impatience. The standoff had begun, and dawn would decide who survived it. Snow swirled across the open ground, drifting between the two sides like a silent witness. The woman stood tall, though her knees trembled beneath the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The cowboy remained beside her, not in front of her, not shielding her like someone helpless, but standing with her as an equal. She felt his presence steady her like a rooted tree during a windstorm. The ridge above held the man she once trusted. His horse snorted clouds of breath into the cold night as torchlight flickered against hardened faces behind him. They expected her to surrender quietly. They expected fear to crush her spirit now that she had nowhere left to run. But she didn't bow. She raised her chin and called out again, this time with her voice strong and unshaken. She told him she had seen what he'd done, seen how he traded land and safety for power. She spoke of families scattered, elders silenced, camps controlled. She said that wasn't leadership. It was betrayal. The voices around him shifted, men glancing at one another in doubt. The truth she carried wasn't a weapon of steel, but of memory, and it cut deeper than any blade. The leader tried to silence her with warnings, saying she spoke like an outsider now. But she shook her head and told him she spoke like someone who still cared, someone who remembered what they promised to protect long before greed took root. He rode a few steps closer, his expression torn between anger and old loyalty. The riders behind him hesitated, the unity he controlled beginning to crack. The cowboy watched silently, his rifle lowered but ready. He knew this wasn't his fight to lead, yet he was prepared to step in the moment anyone reached for her. His calm presence forced the riders to think twice before acting. When she spoke the name of the man who helped her escape, the ridge fell quiet. She revealed that he wasn't killed for treason like they had been told. He survived, wounded but alive, hidden by those who still believed in the old ways. That truth shook the group harder than any accusation. The man on the ridge clenched the reins as though the truth itself burned his hands. A few riders backed their horses away, no longer certain they were on the right side. The leader saw his control slipping and tried to rally them by calling her a threat again. But his voice no longer carried the same power. Snow fell harder now, covering his tracks as though nature refused to let his rise to power be remembered. Slowly, some riders turned their horses and left, disappearing into the dark valley. Others stayed, caught between loyalty and doubt. The leader looked down at her one last time, eyes full of wounded pride. He told her she chose a path that would change everything. She answered that change was overdue, without another word. He pulled his horse around and rode away with those still loyal to him. The storm swallowed their silhouettes. The remaining men lingered a moment longer until silence settled over the land again. They lowered their heads in respect before turning away. Leaving without violence, leaving without taking her back, snow fell gently now, not harsh like before. The night, once filled with tension, felt almost peaceful. The woman exhaled deeply, her body shaking from relief and exhaustion. Her strength held just long enough to face them, then crumbled once the danger faded. The cowboy placed a hand on her shoulder to steady her. She leaned into him, not from weakness, but from trust. They walked back toward the cabin in slow steps, both worn from what had passed. Inside, the fire still burned, waiting like a warm reminder that life continued beyond fear. She sat near the flames, silent and thoughtful. While he hung his coat by the door and watched her carefully, he asked what she planned to do now that she was no longer running. She didn't answer right away. She looked into the flames, remembering faces lost, homes burned, and years spent wandering. She said she wanted to return south, not to fight, but to help rebuild what was broken, to bring truth to those who didn't know what happened. She knew her words could heal or divide, but silence could no longer keep anyone safe. He listened, knowing he couldn't choose her path for her. But he asked if she had to do it alone. She looked up, surprised by the question. She had spent so long escaping that she forgot she could choose companionship. She asked why he would follow her into a land that wasn't his. He said she wasn't just someone he found in the snow. She had become a reason to keep living again, a reason to move forward instead of staying alone with ghosts of winter. Her eyes softened, warmed by something deeper than apology or gratitude. She reached across the distance between them and placed her hand on his, holding it slowly, like something earned. Days passed as the storm lifted and the land thawed. They prepared supplies together, fixing saddles, packing herbs, securing weapons only for protection. The journey south would be long, but neither feared the distance. The cowboy rebuilt part of the broken fence before leaving, not because he planned to stay, but because he wanted his land to reflect peace rather than battle. When the morning finally came for them to ride out, the sun rose clear, turning the snow into a silver sheet across the plains. She mounted a horse with steady breath, wrapped not in torn frozen cloth this time, but in a warm blanket he gave her. He rode beside her, eyes forward but glancing at her with quiet certainty. They didn't rush. The land stretched wide ahead of them, filled with reminders of hardship and hope. She carried knowledge that could restore what was lost. He carried loyalty that could protect her along the way. Neither knew what waited in the southern camps, but they rode toward a future shaped by intention rather than fear. The world felt calmer than the night she first collapsed in the storm, though her heart still carried the memory of cold before the trail disappeared behind them. She looked back at the small cabin that had saved her life. It no longer looked like a lonely place. It looked like the beginning of something she never expected to find. She whispered that fate had strange ways of leading people together. The cowboy nodded, saying sometimes storms didn't come to destroy, but to bring lost souls to the right doorstep. They turned their horses toward the sun and continued their journey, side by side, leaving the winter valley behind. Their story didn't end with rescue in the snow. It began there.